Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Frankfurt's lecture on taking ourselves seriously. So let us begin. So the first question for us is, what does it mean to take ourselves seriously? And here's kind of the basic idea that Frankfurt puts forth. He thinks that to take ourselves seriously is to sincerely inquire into what to do and what kinds of persons to be. So at that level of description, it seems so vague and so general that it's not very that informative. But here's the kind of idea that Frankfurt has in mind. Before Frankfurt, people like Aristotle would say things like, uh, people act, right? We do things, and then our actions gradually form patterns, and they create habits, and then they develop characters, and that's how we become what we are. So we do something courageous and then we something courageous again and so on. So we create this pattern of being courageous. So we become courageous by acting in a courageous fashion consistently. And that's not a peculiar fact about courage, that all of the habits work that way. We start doing things in the world. And then the more consistently we do them, we become those kinds of people. Start playing the piano. And then if we keep doing it, we become piano players, right? So our destiny, our character, who we are, our identities are formed through gradual actions. So Frankfurt says, yeah, all of that is correct. However, that's not like the heart of what it is to be a person. What it seems to be distinct about a person is not merely that we act, and in acting, we create patterns and we develop characters and identities, but rather that we sincerely inquire into those things. In other words, we don't just act and become different kind of people. We wonder what we should do. We wonder what kind of person we should become. So we have this kind of reflective capacity to think about the motivations for our actions, the things we're doing, and the kinds of persons that we're becoming. And for Frankfurt, it is that reflective capacity to inquire into what we should be doing, what is good for us to do, and what kind of persons to be. Like it is those self-reflective capacities that are essential to what it is to be a person. That's what it is to take ourselves seriously, not merely to act and become a particular kind of person, but to care about, to sincerely inquire into what we're doing and what kind of person we're becoming, and thereby take control over those actions and what kind of persons we become. So here's what he says. Two features of our nature are centrally implicated in this. Our ability to take ourselves seriously is centrally implicated in two distinct capacities. Our ability to think, to be rational, and our ability to love. Reason and love play critical roles in determining what we think and how we care how we are moved to conduct ourselves in the world. Uh, so historically, people have noticed these things, and someone like Aristotle would have said that reason becomes the ground for the possibility of love. So reason takes a kind of precedence over. You can only engage in a loving relationship with someone else if you're a rational agent, if you can think, if you can deliberate. That makes you be able to think about truths about like loving someone is desirable, to love someone is to care for their good, things like that. So it is the capacity to reason that enables you to enter loving relationships. Frankfurt's actually going to invert the picture. He's going to say that love is in some deep ways more fundamental than reason. In fact, as we'll see later, he thinks that love kind of provides the machinery, the kind of the things that upon which reason operates. Reason depends upon love for its very capacities for reasoning. Frankfurt's going to argue. So it's going to be a relatively radical view. Um, so here's how he describes what he takes to be central to being a person. Again, persons don't just act and become things, but rather here's what he says. Central to being a person is the ability for separating from the immediate content and flow of our consciousness and introducing a sort of division within our minds. And that division enables us to establish a kind of inward directed monitoring oversight. So what he's saying is that he has in mind the distinction between a sentient being, a person, a being with a mind in the body, and things like rocks have bodies, right? They are bodies. Things like dogs have minds and have bodies. And what it is to have a mind is to be conscious, to have this kind of mental story, mental flow of consciousness. And that flow of consciousness is the thing that is happening within the mind of the sentient being when there's sensory stimulation coming from without and is interacting with the biological predeterminations, preconditions of the genes of the particular sentient being. So the way we think, anyway, the mental life of dogs works is that they are kind of settled by biological preconditions, instincts, feelings, emotions, things like that. And those feelings, emotions, biological preconditions interact with the environment in a particular way. If the dog sees, water, the dog salivates and is moved to, drink the water. And there's this kind of flow of consciousness within the mental life of the dog, which has to do with the perceptual recognition of the object desired, the water. And there's this recognition of the drive, the thirst that is moving the dog to act, right? All of that is kind of like the description of the inner content of the flow of the mind, which again depends upon the sensory stimulation and the way the sensory stimulation interacts with the genetics of the sentient being. And Frankfurt points out, we are animals too. So we have all of that. And in fact, that's what we think dogs work that way, because we introspect upon our own mental life and we see that that's how we work to a large extent. However, and crucially, we have something very distinct as well. We are persons, and as such, we can have this internal sort of division. We can introspect upon our own, the flow of our own consciousness. And that becomes a kind of inward directed monitor oversight. In other words, we have this self, which is capable of introspecting upon and saying, oh, look, I'm thirsty. Oh, look, thirst recommends that I drink water. Oh, look, I want to play video games, and the desire to play video games kind of push towards, playing a video game. Oh, look, I feel tired. I want to sit down. So we have this self-monitoring kind of inner monologue, this ability to identify some of the inner workings of our psychology. And that is, Frankfurt thinks, distinctive of persons, that capacity to separating ourselves from something like the inner workings of our mind, which in some deep sense are also ourselves. So there's this kind of fundamental division within what it is to be a person. And that is going to be crucial for a psychiatry of love, reason, responsibility, authenticity, freedom of the will, and so on. So that's a very fundamental observation about human psychology. So crucially, Frankfurt makes a distinction between higher order or second order volitions in first order volitions. First order volitions are desires that are aimed at actions. You decide to drink the water is the first order volition. It feels a particular way. Second order volitions or higher order volitions are desires or wills about first order desires, right? You might feel your desire to drink some water, but you can also form the desire not to act on the basis of that because you're doing something else, say, you're watching a show or something. So you can have desires about your desires. Those are second order desires for your first order desires. And the way that Frankfurt thinks about it, we identify with some of our thoughts or desires, some of the elements within the flow of consciousness by this process of forming higher order desires. We say, yeah, I like that particular desire to win. I don't want that one to win, right? Like I want the desire to stay and watch the movie to win over the desire to get up and drink water. And that's a way of identifying with some of the first order volitions that are part of the flow of consciousness. We form the desire that one versus the other wins. And we thereby become identified with that. And Frankfurt's going to make a big deal about this identity and this ability to identify with some of the elements of the first order volitions of our consciousness. So all of this raises important philosophical questions. So both Frankfurt and people before him have noticed that we are not completely self-made. We like to tell ourselves stories that we're self-made and we're thereby responsible for actions, but we're not, right? So the distinction between the merely sentient beings like dogs and ourselves illustrates the large extent to which who we are, the persons that we become, depends upon things like our biological makeup and the way in which our environment influences our biological makeup. To be a sentient being just is to be the kind of being for whom, like, what you are, what settles your actions and what you become, just as the interplay between the biological setup and the environmental conditions. The distinctive capacity of persons is that we can reflect upon that, and then we can take control over some of that. But still, that raises the question, if we are what we are, largely because of our biology and our environment, are we responsible for our actions? Here's one traditional story. This is Aristotle's story. Aristotle says we are responsible for our actions, and we are responsible for our characters, and we are responsible for the kinds of people that we are: courageous, coward, and so on. We're responsible for that because part of the development of the character trait is the result of our choices. This is Aristotle's view. So yes, part of the result of who we are depends upon our biology. A large part of it depends on our biology. Another large part of it depends on the environment, the particular setting, the way in which people treated us, and accidents that we may have had, and things like that. So the environment is completely outside of our control, or at least largely outside of our control. Biology is completely, or at least largely, outside of our control. So two of the major factors that settle who we are completely outside of our control, or at least largely outside of our control. Yet Aristotle thinks we can still be responsible, provided that part of that story includes our choices. As long as our character is at least in part the result of our choices, not just biology and environment, then we are responsible. In Aristotle thinks that is the case. We have a say in who we are. It's a small say, but it's still a say in who we are by our choices. And because of that, we count as responsible. So if we're cowards, we can be held responsible for our cowardice, even though a cowardice is partly grounded in the fact that we're very afraid, and that's a biological fact about us. And also the things we were exposed to, watch a lot of scary movies and things like that, that then made the fear more intense. Even though those things are correct, we're still responsible for actions because we got to choose to do different things, which were also part of the development to becoming a coward person. So we're responsible for being cowards in anything else that we have, says Aristotle. Frankfurt's going to disagree. He's going to have a very different view. Here's what he says. I think Aristotle is wrong about this. Becoming responsible, not being responsible, becoming responsible for one's character is not essentially a matter of producing that character. In other words, it doesn't really matter, says Frankfurt, how you got to be what you are now. The story of how you got to become coward or courageous or kind or benevolent or cruel or whatever, like how you got there, Frankfurt thinks, is not that important. For Aristotle, that's the whole point, is that you got there by, in part, your choices you made in the past. That's what made you responsible. Frankfurt says that's not that relevant how you got there. What matters is whether or not you take responsibility for what you have now or what you are now. It is your taking responsibility that makes you responsible agents. You're not responsible prior to you taking responsibility. It is the act of taking responsibility for your character that makes you responsible for your character. So what is this taking responsibility for? It is identifying with. It's the same story we just looked at. So the quote continues. This happens, that is, we identify with, we take responsibility. This happens when a person selectively identifies with certain of his own attitudes and dispositions. So Frankfurt realizes that we have so much like desires, intentions, motivations, thoughts, and so on. There's a lot of complicated interplay in our psychology, interplay of multiple different factors. And he thinks we're not responsible for it all because most of it is a result of, again, biology and environment. But we are responsible for some of it. What part of it are we responsible? The one that we identify with. So we have the power to create our own true selves, and we create our true selves by identifying with some elements of our inner psychology. We identify with the desire to know, or we identify with the desire to play video games. So we identify to the desire to go drink water, whatever. And to the extent that those are morally relevant, we're responsible for those. And in fact, we're taking responsibility for being the kind of person that, say, learns if we identify with the desire to learn. And this is true whether or not it was he, the agent, that caused him to have this. So it doesn't matter how it is that you got to have the desire to know, say, for example. What matters is whether or not you identify with that desire and take responsibility for being the person that has the desire to know, and thereby act on the basis of that and becoming knowledgeable. Or the desire to be cruel. If you have the desire to be cruel, Frankfurt says you're not responsible for that yet, anyways. If you identify with the desire and you form the second order desire to be the kind of person that is moved by cruelty, Now you're responsible, because now that becomes part of your true self. And now we can be blamed for it. That's true regardless of how it is that you got the desire to be cruel. Maybe, people treated you very cruelly, and that's how the desire started growing within you. That story, Frankfurt thinks, is not as crucial. It's your capacity to identify with and then own that desire that makes you responsible. Anyway, in identifying with them, first order volitions, he incorporates those attitudes and dispositions into himself and makes them his own. You identify with and make your own some elements in your psychology, the flow of your consciousness, only by identifying with them. And identifying with them, again, is forming second order volitions that say, yeah, that's me. That's what I want to do. That's the kind of person I want to become. That's the kind of desire I want to do, and so on. And identifying with those things, we take responsibilities for them, claims Frankfurt. So what counts is our effort to define and to manage ourselves. And that's what we do by identifying. And not the story of how we come to be in the situation in which we are now in. So how we got to where we are is not the relevant. Biological predispositions, not the relevant. Environment, not the relevant. Relevant for what? For being responsible. We're responsible by identifying with those factors within our psychology. And that's the ground for our responsibility. So if we are striving to undo a previously acquired habit, for example, we are not responsible for the ongoing presence of this habit, right? You develop the habit of being lazy, the habit of being courageous, or the habit of being narrow-minded. Frankfurt thinks you're not responsible for that if you no longer identify with the kind of person that is narrow-minded. If you no longer identify with the motivations of being narrow-minded, now you're no longer responsible. Why? Because now it is against your will. Maybe in the past you identify with narrow-mindedness, in which case you were responsible for being narrow-minded. But if you have changed in the way in the following way, you no longer identify with your willingness to be narrow-minded. You're no longer responsible. You have no longer taken responsibility for that element of your psychology, and you can do that, and that would gradually shape you into a different kind of person. You're no longer responsible for the elements of your psychology that you no longer identify with, claims Frankfurt. So this machinery gives us a nice picture of authenticity as well. And I kind of hinted at that already, but here's what Frankfurt says about the nature of authenticity. This willing acceptance of attitudes, this ability to identify with attitudes, thoughts, and feelings transforms their status. Right? So think about the thoughts, feelings, and attitudes of a mere sentient being like a dog. They see the water, they're desirous of the water, they think in some sense of things like, hey, there's water that associates my desire, perhaps. But anyway, there are these elements in the flow of consciousness of a sentient being that are moving them about in the world. Frankfurt says, we that have the capacity to reflect upon them and identify with some of those, the form volitions of being the kind of person for whom that desire wins. In doing that, it transforms the status of those first order volitions. The first order volitions, are no longer merely items that happen to appear in a certain psychic history. They're not just elements in the dynamics of inner psychology that lead to action. We have taken responsibility for them. And in doing so, we have identified with them as authentic expressions of ourselves. Authenticity lies with acting on the basis of the elements of first order volitions, desires that we have taken responsibility for, that is, that we have identified with, that they constitute our true self. So we do not regard them as disconnected from us, those elements that we have identified with, or as alien intruders by which we are helplessly beset. The fact that we have adopted and sanctioned them makes them intentional and legitimate. Some elements in our psychology are going to be things that seem like an alien intruders. A weird thought about, one of the examples Frankfurt uses is that he loves his son, and then someday the son does something very annoying, and this weird thought of like injuring or hurting the son comes to Frankfurt's mind. And then Frankfurt thinks that that's not his thought in any real sense, right? It occurred in the story of his psychic development, his, the flow of consciousness of his particular mental life, but it's not really him. It just is a result of biology or something. It's only him. It's only legitimate, authentic to Frankfurt if Frankfurt identifies with the desire. But Frankfurt thinks his love for his son is so radically opposed to that desire that there's no way Frankfurt can identify with that desire to harm his son. So the desire comes in and then it dissipates and disappears, and the story continues. And it was never truly part of Frankfurt's authenticity, part of his true self. Why? Because he didn't identify with it. But if he were to identify with it, say if he identifies with his love for his son, then the force of the desire becomes the force of the identity of Frankfurt. When that desire moves Frankfurt, Frankfurt is no longer passive, is no longer being pushed around by his desires and his biology. He's in control of his life, and he's acting in authentic expressions of his self by acting on the basis of the desires with which he has identified. In that case, agents are truly acting, they're responsible, and they're authentic. Frankfurt continues. Sometimes we do not participate actively in what goes on in us. It takes place somehow, but we are just bystanders to it. Again, some thoughts, emotions, things just kind of find themselves, make their way into our inner psychology, into our flow of consciousness. But that doesn't mean that they're ours. That doesn't mean that they express who we are. There are obsessional thoughts, for instance, that disturbs us, but that we cannot get out of our heads. There are peculiar and reckless impulses that make no sense to us and upon which we would never think of acting. So anyway, so Frankfurt is pointing out that the inner kind of display or description of the flow of consciousness, the kind of interplay between different psychological factors that settle human actions, that involves a lot of elements that seem alien to us. Where when we introspect upon our own psychology, we stumble upon thoughts, beliefs, tendencies, habits that we think like, "Ooh, what's up with that? Like I don't like that." Frankfurt says you have the power to identify with some and not other of those, and thereby define who you are in this more narrow sense. And then you are authentic when you act on the basis of that more narrow set of desires that you have identified with. So you have a large kind of control over your true self. You don't just introspect upon yourself, and whatever you find there is you, as someone like Rousseau might say. For Frankfurt, no, you find stuff there, but doesn't mean it's you. You get to choose what is you, what part of that is you. So you have a lot more kind of ability to define yourself and then act authentically on the basis of your self-definition. And you define yourself by identifying with some elements in your psychology and thereby allow them to become more prominent in the long run, the overall shape of your life. But anyway, this is a good place to stop. So I'll see you next time. Bye.